There are moments in the Imperium when the veil between devotion and dread becomes so thin that even the faithful hesitate to breathe. They say the Emperor's light is the only thing that keeps the galaxy from collapsing into eternal night, that without his presence the Astronomicon would gutter out like a dying spark and all human souls would drift blind through the void. But few ever speak about the cost of keeping that light burning. Fewer still have stood close enough to feel the truth pressing against their bones, a truth that smells of cold incense and ancient machinery, a truth that watches you even when it cannot see. To be chosen is to be claimed. To walk the final path is to feel the universe narrowing around you until every step echoes inside your skull. And when the doors close behind you, when the chant rises and the air grows sharp with ozone, you realize something you were never meant to know. You are not walking toward salvation. You are walking toward a hunger older than the Imperium itself. Before we descend into that silence, before we unseal the corridors where names dissolve and flesh becomes fuel, take a moment to steady yourself. If tales like these hold you the way they have held countless others, then lend your voice to this channel. Like, share, and subscribe, not out of obligation, but because the more of us who speak, the more the darkness listens. The summons arrived long before dawn, when the hive still murmured in its sleep and the sky above the upper spires glimmered with the faint, dying blue of a false morning. I woke to the sound of boots against metal, a slow, synchronized march that made the pipes in the walls tremble. The air tasted of cold iron and ash, the usual breath of our district, yet something in it felt sharpened, as if the hive itself sensed what was coming. My mother was already sitting up, her hands clasped so tightly that the bones stood out like pale ridges beneath her skin. She didn't look at me at first. She just listened, counting the steps, the rhythm, the number of troopers. The administratum never arrived quietly. They wanted the hive to hear them coming. Outside, the vox horns crackled to life with a burst of static that echoed across the hab blocks. A voice followed, smooth but hollow, like a servitor trying to mimic human warmth. It declared the beginning of the Psychotithe selection with a calm finality that made the floor seem to tilt beneath my feet. I had known this day was approaching. Everyone had. You could feel its shadow weeks in advance, stalking the fringes of our routines. Some said it began with strange dreams or the flickering of lumen globes at night. Others claimed the chosen felt a kind of pulling, as though the air tugged at the edges of their thoughts. For me, it had been the silence, the way conversations would stop when I entered a room, the way people looked away too quickly. Fear changes how people see you, especially when they have no proof, only suspicion. Mother finally turned her eyes toward me. They were dark and red-rimmed, like she hadn't slept for days. "Stay close," she whispered, though there was nowhere to go that would matter. "Give them no reason to notice you." But they always noticed. The administratum scribes stepped into the hab block with their long data slates and ink-black robes trailing behind them, flanked by 2 squads of Astra Militarum troopers whose lasguns gleamed beneath the flickering ceiling strips. The scribes moved through the crowd as if the air parted for them, their expressions unreadable, their pale faces half-lit by the glow of their devices. A low hum filled the corridor, the psyker detector rigs. They were bulky, brass-framed devices carried by servitors whose eyes were dull gray marbles drifting beneath half-open lids. The rigs hissed and clicked softly as they activated, bathing the corridor in faint green pulses that smelled like ionized metal. People pressed themselves against the walls, clutching beads, charms, and the small carved symbols of the Imperial Aquila. I could feel the pulse brushing over my skin, a cold sweep that left gooseflesh crawling up my arms. Each time the detector passed someone, they held their breath, waiting for the rising pitch that meant their life had just ended in a single mechanical note. When the rig turned toward me, the hum deepened. I felt it vibrating in my ribs, in my teeth. A bead of sweat slid down my spine. My mother's fingers tightened around my arm hard enough to bruise. The servitor paused. Its metal jaw twitched. For a heartbeat too long, no one moved. Then the pitch dropped back to normal, and the rig moved on. My mother exhaled shakily, her hand trembling as she brushed my hair from my face. But the scribe standing nearby was still watching me. His eyes were small and sharp behind a pair of brass-rimmed lenses, and there was something in his gaze that made the air feel thicker, harder to swallow. He wrote something on his slate. Not a mark of guilt. Not yet. But a note. A possibility. A question. They continued down the corridor, gathering the selected one by one. A girl from the third floor who'd been seen talking to herself. A miner whose dreams had been loud enough for those sleeping near him to hear. A quiet boy no older than 12 who burst into tears when the green pulse passed over him, the detector shrieking with a rising pitch that made everyone flinch. His mother tried to shield him, but the troopers dragged her aside. You didn't fight the tithe. Not unless you wanted the entire Hab block punished for your defiance. By midday, a line of the Chosen had formed outside the administratum shuttle, each person marked with a strip of red cloth tied around their wrist. Some stood silently, hollow-eyed. Others cried openly. One man chanted prayers under his breath, his voice shaking with each syllable. I could feel an ache building behind my eyes, a pressure like a storm rolling in from somewhere just beyond awareness. I kept swallowing against it, forcing myself to breathe evenly. I imagined sealing every thought behind a wall, imagining each brick stacking over the next, holding everything inside. But walls crack. When the scribe returned to me, the corridor felt suddenly too narrow. His shadow stretched across my feet. He lifted the detector rig again, slower this time, as though he already knew what it would say. The hum grew louder than before, deeper, almost resonant, like it recognized me. My breath stilled in my chest. The air spiraled inward. Something warm flickered behind my eyes. And when the pitch lifted, higher than it had for anyone else, every person in the corridor took a step back. The scribe nodded once and tied the red cloth around my wrist. The world narrowed to that single touch of fabric, rough against my skin, final as a sealed door. The moment the red cloth tightened around my wrist, the hive seemed to tilt away from me, as if the entire structure, steel, stone, smoke, and all, had taken one collective step back. People avoided my eyes. Mothers pulled their children closer. Even the troopers, helmets expressionless and unmoving, shifted in a way that suggested unease. A psyker marked for tithe was not simply someone chosen by the Imperium. They were someone the warp had noticed, and that made everyone around them suddenly fragile. My mother made a sound, something between a gasp and a plea, but it dissolved into the stale air. The scribe had already moved on. His task was mechanical, unburdened by grief. Mine was just another name entered onto the slate, a line in a ledger that would disappear into archives thicker than continents. I reached for her, but the Astra Militarum trooper standing beside me raised a gloved hand. Not harshly, but with a solemn firmness that said the time for holding on had already passed. "You may speak," he murmured quietly, so only we could hear. "But do not touch." The restraint in his voice was unexpected. Troopers were usually curt, detached. This one sounded as though he carried a weight of his own. My mother stepped forward, keeping just enough distance that the trooper didn't intervene. Her lips trembled, and for a long moment she couldn't form words. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a breath. "You're strong. You always have been. Remember that. Strength." I didn't feel strong. I felt hollow, as if something inside me had been scooped out while I wasn't looking. But I nodded anyway, because she needed the gesture more than I needed honesty. They allowed only a moment before urging her back into the crowd. The door to the corridor slid shut between us with a hiss, sealing her away as cleanly as if she had been cut from a picture. I stood there, staring at the dented metal, trying to lock her face into memory before the world around me pulled everything else apart. The Chosen were herded toward the transport platform in groups of 20. The air grew colder the deeper we went, the great ventilation shafts exhaling drafts that smelled faintly of chemicals and far-off machinery. People walked stiffly, wrists marked with red, heads lowered. Some wept silently. Others muttered half-formed prayers. A few stared ahead with the rigid calm of those who had already accepted the shape of their fate. I could feel the pressure in my skull building again, slow and insistent, like someone knocking from the inside of my mind. I tried to drown it beneath the steady rhythm of my steps, but each time my thoughts wandered, the pressure nudged back, a presence with no shape, no words, only a watchfulness that made my skin prickle. A boy walking beside me suddenly stumbled. He couldn't have been older than 14. His hair shorn unevenly as though cut in haste. He pressed both hands to his temples, teeth clenched so hard his jaw quivered. The trooper behind him moved quickly, steadying him before he fell. "It's the noise," the boy whispered. His voice cracked. "Do you hear it? The humming. It's inside." "Eyes forward," the trooper said gently, almost soothingly. "Stay with us. You're not alone." I looked at the trooper more closely. His armor bore faint scarring, the kind left by close-quarters firefights. Too old to be fresh from training. Too steady to be indifferent. I wondered how many times he had walked this route, escorting people like us. People whose minds frayed around the edges, whose thoughts sometimes leaked where they shouldn't. We reached the platform. The administratum shuttle crouched in the center like a predatory insect of polished steel. Its hull was engraved with biting runes of authority and lit by pale blue lumen strips that flickered with each gust of the hive's breath. A ramp unfolded with a hydraulic groan, and the scent that drifted out was sterile and cold, sharper than the air outside. The troopers guided us toward it, forming a narrow lane on each side. The crowd above watched from the railings, hundreds of faces stacked in layers, silent, staring. No cheers, no farewells, just the heavy, collective exhale of a hive surrendering part of itself. As I stepped onto the ramp, the pressure in my mind surged, as if reacting to the proximity of something on the shuttle. The air inside felt different, thicker, weighted with anticipation or memory or both. A sensation like static whispered across my thoughts, too faint to parse, too present to ignore. Rows of restraint seats lined the interior, each one equipped with harnesses and sedation injectors. I hesitated. Sitting felt like admitting this was real. Standing felt like defiance the Imperium wouldn't tolerate. The trooper who had spoken before appeared at my side. He placed a hand on the back of the seat in front of me, not forcing, just guiding. "Breathe slowly," he said. "The first flight is always the hardest." It struck me then, the familiarity in his tone. He wasn't speaking to a criminal or a casualty. He was speaking to someone he didn't expect to see again, someone whose fear deserved at least a shred of dignity. I lowered myself into the seat. The harness clicked into place across my chest, snug and unyielding. The red cloth around my wrist brushed against the metal buckle, a whisper of fabric that felt almost louder than the hum of engines beginning to stir beneath the floor. One by one, the others were secured. The hiss of pressurized doors closing at the front echoed like a final breath being held. When the ramp rose behind us, sealing off the last view of the hive, the darkness in the shuttle deepened slightly. The lights dimmed to a cool, steady glow. The engines rumbled low, a sound that reverberated through bone more than metal. A tech priest shuffled into view near the front, his mechadendrite swaying with soft metallic clicks. His voice, filtered through a vox grill, buzzed with ritual precision as he began a litany of activation. The shuttle trembled. The pressure in my mind pulsed once, sharp and bright. And then the ascent began. The shuttle lifted with a force that pressed me deeper into the seat, the restraints creaking as the engines roared to full ascent. The hive fell away beneath us, first the upper platforms vanishing into haze, then the spires dissolving into gray mist, then the entire world shrinking to a smear of rust and smoke. I felt the shift in gravity as a physical drag against my ribs, but it was not the weight of liftoff that unsettled me. It was the absence of sound inside my own mind. The pressure I had felt for days, the quiet thrum behind my eyes. It paused. Not vanished, paused. As though whatever had been watching me also looked down, also listened to the engines, also felt the hive disappear. The silence didn't last. As the shuttle broke the cloud layer, the pressure returned, stronger than before. It moved like a second heartbeat, one that beat not in my chest but somewhere behind my thoughts. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on the cold metal beneath my palms, the faint vibration traveling through the deck, the smell of oil and recycled air. Anything to anchor myself. But the sensation persisted, probing gently, like fingers testing the tension of a wire. Across the aisle, the boy from earlier had curled his knees to his chest as far as the restraints allowed. His lips moved soundlessly. Prayers, I guessed. Or maybe the beginnings of a scream he was trying desperately to swallow. A soft chime rang from the front of the shuttle. The tech priest lifted one mechadendrite, its tip glowing with amber light as he inspected a cluster of runes etched into a brass panel. Warp field dampener stable, he intoned, voice gritty with machine influence. Geller harmonics holding. Passenger vitals, elevated but non-critical. He wasn't speaking to us. He was speaking to the machine spirits, offering comfort or warning. It was never clear with the mechanicus. The trooper who had guided me earlier was unstrapped, standing between the rows with practiced ease despite the ongoing ascent. His expression remained calm, but there was a tension in his eyes, a readiness that suggested he had seen transports go wrong before. Transports full of psychers were unpredictable places. He noticed me watching him. "If you feel pressure in your head," he said quietly, "don't fight it too hard. The more you resist, the more it rebounds." I swallowed. "Does it stop?" "Sometimes," he replied. "Sometimes not." The honesty in his voice tightened something in my chest. I expected reassurance, not truth. Truth tasted sharper. He moved down the line, checking each restraint buckle. When he reached the boy across from me, he knelt slightly. "Tell me your name," he said. The boy's eyes flickered open. "Escila," he whispered. "That's good," the trooper said, nodding once. "Say it again." "Louder." The boy hesitated, then said it again. "Sela." "Good. Keep saying it. Names help you stay anchored." It was something I had never heard before, yet hearing it made sense in a way that bypassed logic and settled into instinct. A name wasn't just identification in the Imperium. A name was a tether. A reminder of flesh when the warp wanted thought alone. The engines shifted pitch as we broke into the upper atmosphere. The shuttle vibrated violently for a moment, then smoothed out as the stars bled into view. Space stretched across the viewport like an endless wound stitched with points of cold light. I felt smaller staring into it, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't insignificance, it was vulnerability. Everything out here could hear you. "Maintain breathing cadence," the tech priest announced as he activated another cluster of runes. "Preparing for transition to the Emperor's Shield network. Expect dissonance." No one asked what dissonance meant. The word alone carried weight, and no one wanted more clarity than necessary. The shuttle angled slightly, engines rumbling as guidance systems locked onto orbital relay signals. The hum behind my eyes sharpened. A whisper brushed the edge of my mind. Not a word, not a voice, just a ripple like fabric catching a sudden breeze. My pulse sped up. I gripped the armrests, willing whatever it was to stay silent. Thoughts weren't supposed to have edges. Thoughts weren't supposed to feel observed. I kept my breathing steady, focused on the cold. Then someone screamed. Not loud, almost strangled, but piercing enough that the entire row flinched. A woman near the back thrashed against her restraints, eyes rolled back, foam bubbling at the corner of her mouth. The pressure in the cabin changed immediately, an unseen shift, like the air had thickened to syrup. The trooper sprinted toward her. The tech priest snapped an order, mechadendrites whipping forward to stabilize readings. A vial clicked into place in an injector unit, and a sedative hissed into the woman's arm. Her back arched once, then slackened against the seat, breaths ragged but slowing. "Psychana flare," the trooper said to the tech priest, wiping sweat from his brow. "She needs containment protocol." "Affirmative," the priest replied. "Warp exposure spike detected." Warp exposure. Even the hint of it was enough to turn stomachs. The boy named Sela whimpered. Is she going to? "She'll be fine," the trooper said. Too quickly. Too sharply. He wasn't lying to comfort. He was lying to stabilize. I closed my eyes again. Not to block the scene, but because the hum was peaking again. Sharp. Insistent. Almost eager. The kind of pressure that made you wonder if the walls of your mind were paper, and something outside was tracing each fold with a curious fingertip. I steadied myself. Focused on breath. My name. My face. My mother's trembling hands. The ramp ceiling shut. The red cloth against my skin. When I opened my eyes, the stars felt closer, as though the void itself was leaning in to listen. The shuttle began its turn toward the waiting ship in orbit, a vessel meant only for psychers. A vessel known in every hive, every shrine, every dark corner of the Imperium. A black ship. The hum in my skull pulsed once, like recognition, and the engines roared. The black ship loomed ahead like a specter against the cold light of Terra's orbit, its hull vast and dark, engraved with arcane symbols that gleamed faintly beneath the distant sun. Even from the shuttle's viewport, it radiated authority. Not the rigid authority of the Adeptus Custodes, nor the disciplined might of an Imperial Navy cruiser, but something older, heavier, as though the weight of every soul it had carried pressed outward from its plates. My chest tightened, not from fear exactly, but from the awareness that we were approaching a finality that dwarfed every waking fear of my life. The shuttle's engines hummed beneath me, a tremor that echoed in my bones, yet the hum behind my thoughts had grown louder, sharper, thrumming with expectation. The trooper who had guided me throughout the flight glanced back once, his expression unreadable in the pale blue glow of the cabin. "Remember your anchors," he said. "Your mind is what carries you through. Let it not unravel before the gates." I nodded, but the words felt like fragile glass against the pressure building inside me. I counted the anchors in my mind. My mother's voice, the sound of the hive's gates clanging closed, the small coin she had pressed into my palm weeks ago. Anchors that now felt both essential and absurd, as though the galaxy itself were trying to pull them away. Around me, the others shifted in their restraints, pale faces pressed to the cold metal of the seats, lips moving silently with prayers or half-forgotten names. The air was thick with anticipation, the scent of ionized metal mingling with faint perfumes of incense that some had managed to smuggle for luck. The shuttle docked with a slow hiss that made the interior shiver. Hydraulic locks engaged, and the ramp lowered in a careful, deliberate gesture, stretching into the yawning entry of the black ship. The light beyond the ramp was unnatural, neither warm nor cold, a luminescence that seemed to suck the edges from everything it touched. Shadows melted into shapes too angular to be human, too precise to be mere machinery. For a moment, the hum behind my eyes quieted, replaced by a distant murmur, as if the black ship itself whispered to every incoming soul, measuring, cataloging, weighing. We stepped onto the ramp in small groups, guided by the same troopers who had shepherded us from the hab block. The floor of the ship was cold steel, etched with runes that pulsed faintly underfoot. Every step echoed louder than it should have, a single note of inevitability reverberating through the cavernous halls. A procession of mechadendrites swayed like vines in some ancient grove, their tips occasionally brushing against data slates to adjust readings, to ensure the harmony of containment. The air smelled of ozone and sterilization, yet beneath that lay something older, a faint tang of resin, burnt incense, and the metallic echo of thousands of minds funneled into singular purpose. Each chosen was led to a seat along the central corridor. Harnesses clamped down across shoulders and chest, restraining but not punitive. Yet restraint was only a pretense. The minds of the psychers themselves were what required containment. A tech priest moved down the aisle, his mechadendrites brushing across the consoles embedded in the hull, murmuring incantations in a dialect older than Terra itself. His voice, filtered through the vox grill, was a melody of authority and ritual, threading through the ship like a liturgical chant meant to soothe, to steady, to enforce. When my harness locked, I was alone with the hum of my own thoughts. The red cloth around my wrist pulsed faintly in my perception, a constant reminder that the choice had been made for me, that the path was sealed. Outside the viewport, the vastness of space stretched endlessly, indifferent, and yet the hum behind my eyes had begun to resonate in rhythm with the thrumming of the ship's warp containment systems. It was no longer a mere sensation. It was a presence, waiting, hungry for recognition, like an old deity testing the sincerity of a novice's devotion. The trooper crouched beside me for a final moment. "Hold on to what is real," he whispered. "Do not let the echoes fool you. The Emperor sees all, but even his light does not always reach the first step inside." He rose and moved to attend the others. I watched his back, wondering if he carried memories of every soul that had passed these corridors before me. Every face, every scream, every prayer. I imagined the weight of it pressing into his spine, and yet his posture remained unbowed. I envied that composure, though I knew envy itself was a dangerous luxury. The hatch behind us sealed. The lights dimmed to a pale amber. The black ship began to hum in earnest, not the mechanical rumble of engines, but a resonance that seemed to thread through metal, flesh, and bone alike. My mind reached out instinctively, anchoring to names, to voices, to memory. Mother's face, Sela's whispered syllables, the taste of cold iron in the hive's corridors. Anchors stretched across the void, tenuous yet stubborn. The ship tilted, aligning itself with a trajectory that would carry us into orbit above Terra. The pressure inside my head peaked, a wave of thought I could neither name nor resist, and in that instant, I understood. This was not a journey merely through space, but a passage into something vast, almost incomprehensible. Something that would see every fragment of mind laid bare, and weigh it, measure it, consume it if found lacking. And then the corridor ahead shimmered faintly as we approached the inner sanctum. A whisper reached me through the hum, a brush of thought that was almost like words, yet not quite. Chosen, welcome. I pressed my eyes closed. Somewhere deep in my chest, hope and dread tangled into a single, unyielding thread. And I realized there was no turning back. The shuttle had delivered us. The black ship had claimed us. The first chapter of our reckoning was complete. Beyond this point, only the path through the Emperor's will remained, and the cost of understanding it. The corridor of the black ship stretched endlessly, lit by a pale amber glow that seemed to pulse in time with the faint hum underfoot. Each step echoed as though the steel itself remembered the footsteps of countless psychers who had passed this way before. The air smelled faintly of ozone, resin, and the faint tang of sweat and fear. I had learned, quickly, that the black ship was not a vessel of comfort. It was a cathedral, a tomb, and a crucible rolled into one. Every corner, every shadow, every flicker of light seemed to weigh upon the mind, probing the edges of thought, testing what could hold and what would fracture. The others moved silently beside me, harnessed and constrained, yet their presence pressed as heavily on my senses as the machinery itself. Some whispered prayers, their lips moving so faintly I had to lean forward to catch a syllable. Others stared outward through the reinforced viewport, their eyes reflecting the scattered stars like trapped insects in amber. A girl a few rows ahead traced the edge of her harness with trembling fingers, muttering fragments of liturgies she could not remember in full. Every sound, every motion, seemed magnified by the stillness of the ship, a kind of suspended reality where the slightest gesture resonated as if amplified by the universe itself. The trooper who had guided me in the shuttle remained close, unstrapped yet silent, moving with careful, deliberate precision. He never spoke unnecessarily, yet the occasional glance, the half-cocked tilt of his helmet, suggested he was observing everything. The smallest ticks, the faintest pulses of fear, the warp-tainted resonance that lingered like static in our minds. His presence was a tether, as vital to our fragile sanity as the anchors I clutched in memory. My mother, the hive, the small coin pressed into my palm. Each anchor was a lifeline against the tide of sensation that surged through the vessel. A tech priest moved along the central aisle, mechadendrites brushing across the consoles embedded in the deck. They whispered in clicks and hums, the liturgical murmurs of the machine god flowing through brass pipes and amplifiers. The priest's voice, filtered through a vox grill, carried a cadence both precise and ritualistic. He murmured calibrations and prayers to stabilizers I could not see, invoking rites that had been practiced for millennia. Every word was a reminder that this journey, though mechanical, was also profoundly spiritual. A test of body, mind, and soul. I focused on the hum, the ever-present resonance that pressed against my thoughts. It had become a companion of sorts, though I did not trust it. It carried with it a curiosity, almost an awareness, as if the ship itself, or something aboard it, had recognized me. I could feel it brushing against the edges of memory, brushing against fragments of thought I had kept buried. The sensation was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. To resist it was to invite chaos. To surrender was to risk being consumed. The paradox gnawed at me, an invisible predator in the back of my mind. Outside the viewport, the void stretched endlessly. Stars were not mere points of light. They were markers of the impossible, reminders of the vast gulf between human fragility and the infinite. I imagined each of them as a distant eye, unblinking, indifferent, perhaps even aware. The shuttle's hum, the black ship's deeper vibration, and the subtle resonance behind my thoughts created a symphony that thrummed in perfect, uneasy harmony. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was real. Somewhere ahead, a faint hiss broke the rhythm. A compartment opening, another group of chosen being ushered toward their seats. Their eyes were wide, uncomprehending, and yet they already carried the weight of inevitability. I glimpsed a boy no older than Sela, trembling against his restraints, his lips moving with silent syllables. His fear mirrored my own, and yet there was something unspoken, a quiet understanding. The journey was not yet over, but it had begun, and nothing could stop it. A sudden vibration ran through the deck, deeper than the engines or stabilizers. The hum behind my skull spiked sharply, a signal too precise to be coincidence. I gritted my teeth, forced myself to breathe steadily. The trooper's hand brushed briefly against my shoulder. not in comfort, but in acknowledgement. He understood the signal, though he did not speak of it. Some things were understood without words on the black ship. The tech priest's voice rose then, sharp and resonant, issuing commands and incantations that cut through the tense air. Mechadendrites swirled around the consoles, adjusting, probing, whispering. I caught snippets of words I barely understood. Containment, resonance, harmonics, discipline. Each word was a tether to reality, each action a safeguard against the tide of warp energy that pulsed faintly beneath the ship's hull. The black ship was alive in ways we could not fully comprehend, a predator and a protector intertwined, carrying us forward toward the Emperor's dominion. I closed my eyes and anchored myself again. My mother's trembling hands, the red cloth on my wrist, the coin pressed into my palm. Names, memories, fragments of home, all became lines holding me against a pull that sought to unravel thought itself. And as the ship angled further into orbit, the first whispers of Terra's presence reached us, subtle yet undeniable. The planet's shadow stretched across the void like a judgment, and the distant glimmer of the Imperial Palace promised a destination both revered and feared, impossible in its scale, yet inevitable in its gravity. The journey had begun, but the real test was only ahead. The black ship's engines thrummed steadily now, a deep resonance that seeped into every joint, every sinew, every nerve ending. The hum behind my eyes pulsed in rhythm with it, and I realized it had become something like a second heartbeat, insistent, probing, impossible to ignore. Around me, the other psychers remained still, harnessed and constrained, yet their presence was no less tangible than the ship itself. Some whispered prayers, others stared outward, unblinking, their faces pale and drawn. The air smelled faintly of ozone and sterilization, but beneath that was the subtle tang of fear and anticipation, mingled with the almost imperceptible scent of resin from the runes etched into the floor and walls. Sela shifted beside me, knees pressed to his chest, lips moving in soft, tremulous syllables. His small voice was a thread against the roaring resonance, delicate yet defiant. I can hear it, he murmured, eyes wide. The pulling. I swallowed. I had heard it too, not as words, not as sound, but as a tugging at the edges of thought. The black ship was not merely a vessel. It was a conduit, a lens through which the warp reached toward us, brushing lightly against the minds it carried. The sensation was disorienting and intimate, the kind that made the air feel thicker, the deck beneath us harder, the walls closer, as though the entire ship had become a single organism, aware of our presence and responsive to it. The trooper who had guided us so far moved down the aisle with deliberate slowness, unstrapped yet vigilant. His eyes flicked to each of us as if measuring the warp touch on our psyches, noting the subtle tremors and twitches that spoke louder than words. When he reached Sela, he crouched slightly. "Keep saying your name," he instructed. "Anchor yourself. Names are the tether the Emperor cannot touch." It was a simple instruction, yet its weight was immense. I forced my own mind back to the anchors I had chosen. My mother's trembling hands, the coin pressed into my palm, the final echoes of our hab-block corridors. I clutched them tightly, threading them through my consciousness like ropes against the pull of something immense and unrelenting. The tech priest ahead moved with fluid precision, mechadendrites brushing across the consoles, issuing adjustments that were as much ritual as maintenance. His voice resonated through the cabin, filtered and distorted, weaving a chant that was part prayer, part calibration, part warning. The words were unintelligible to me, yet I felt their weight in my chest, a vibration that pressed against the hum behind my skull. Each syllable seemed to push back against the warp pull, each incantation a safeguard against the subtle unraveling that lurked in the edges of consciousness. We passed compartments where other psychers were held, each chamber humming with a resonance unique to its occupant. Some were quiet, resigned to the journey. Others muttered fragments of prayers, their faces pale and drawn. One man, older than the rest, his hair silvered and eyes dull with fatigue, shivered against the harness. I caught a glimpse of his fingers twitching, weaving invisible sigils into the air. The hum behind my eyes spiked as though reacting to him, and I realized that every mind aboard the ship contributed to the vessel's awareness, its resonance. We were not passengers. We were components in a living, breathing machine, each thought, each fear, each prayer a note in a symphony of containment. The stars beyond the viewport glimmered faintly, scattered across the void like cold fire. They were beautiful and terrifying, reminders of the immensity beyond our fragile flesh. The ship tilted slightly, aligning with orbital relays. The hum deepened, became almost sentient, and I felt a tug, not just at the edges of my mind, but through my chest, my ribs, my very bones. A faint whisper of thought brushed against me. Chosen, approach. I blinked rapidly, trying to anchor myself to reality. Sela's voice reached my ears, quiet and tremulous. Is it always like this? I had no answer. Some truths aboard the black ship were ineffable. Some forces were not meant to be parsed or understood, only survived. The trooper moved past us again, eyes scanning, hand lightly brushing my shoulder. Not comfort, but acknowledgement, a reminder that some tether still remained. And then the first warning came. A subtle flicker of light along the viewport, almost imperceptible, but enough to make hearts beat faster. The warp light, fleeting, flickering, danced along the edge of perception. The ship vibrated slightly, and the hum pulsed in sync with something outside, something immense, something waiting. The journey was no longer merely physical. It had become a test, a measure. Every heartbeat, every breath, every memory pressed into service against forces beyond comprehension. To survive this passage, one had to cling not only to anchors, but to identity, to the threads of self that the warp sought to unravel. And still, the black ship carried us forward, unflinching, unstoppable, toward Terra. The black ship moved through orbit like a predator gliding in silence, its hull absorbing the light of distant stars and Terra's pale reflection, bending it into shadows that seemed almost alive. Every vibration through the deck, every hum through the walls, pressed against the edges of thought, and I could feel it probing deeper, teasing the fissures in the mind. Around me, the others remained silent, harnessed and restrained, yet every breath, every tremor of finger against metal, was amplified by the stillness. Even fear itself became tangible, a substance thick enough to taste. Sela leaned closer, his small voice barely audible. Do they know who we are?" he whispered. I didn't answer, because I didn't know. I only knew what it felt like. Being chosen was not a title. It was an inevitability. The ship's hum, the subtle tug behind my thoughts, suggested awareness, intent. We were not simply passengers. We were recognized, catalogued, measured against something beyond comprehension. The trooper moved alongside us, a silent sentinel. His helmet reflected the faint amber lights, masking an expression I could not read. Yet there was a weight to his steps, a rhythm that seemed almost in conversation with the hum. He crouched beside Sela, whispering again, guiding, anchoring. I realized then that this was not his first time escorting the Chosen. He carried centuries of experience in muscle memory, in posture, in the faint cadence of instruction that could calm the warp-touched without ever needing to speak loudly. Ahead, the tech priest moved among the consoles, mechadendrites brushing and adjusting, chanting a litany in clicks and hums that threaded through the cabin like a subtle current. I focused on the rhythm, letting it anchor me alongside the trooper's presence, alongside the red cloth on my wrist, alongside the memory of my mother's hands. Anchors, small, fragile, yet potent. Without them, the tug would have unmade me. The viewport revealed more of Terra as we approached. Even from orbit, the Imperial Palace loomed like a cathedral to gods both seen and unseen, towers of gold and black stretching into clouds that shimmered with perpetual storm. I felt the weight of it, a gravity beyond physics, a sense of scrutiny so profound it pressed upon the soul. Each star reflected in the polished spires seemed like a distant eye, unblinking and patient, waiting. The hum behind my eyes spiked sharply then, not an ambient sensation, but a pulse of intent, an echo of recognition. The ship shifted, subtle adjustments in trajectory that sent ripples through the deck. My thoughts flickered. I held tight to anchors. Names, objects, memories, everything that defined me, everything that separated my mind from the hum. The ship responded, or perhaps it observed, and the resonance softened slightly. Whispers reached us from compartments farther along the ship, half-prayers, muttered syllables, fragments of liturgy. Some voices trembled, some were defiant, some dissolved into silent tears. The black ship did not intervene. It merely listened, calculated, and carried us closer to its purpose. I understood then that we were being prepared not just physically, but spiritually, psychically. Every mind aboard contributed to the vessel's awareness. Every thought was measured, weighed, assessed. Sela's small hand brushed mine briefly, an unconscious anchor against the hum. I squeezed in return, and for a moment the weight in my skull eased. The trooper's presence, the tech priest's murmurs, the small connections between the chosen, these were the only lifelines in a journey designed to unravel certainty. Finally, the ship aligned with the orbital docking station, a massive construct hovering over Terra like a sentinel. Its surface gleamed with a pale, sterile light, etched with the sigils of the Emperor and the Mechanicus, a bridge between mortal comprehension and the machinery of the divine. The black ship's engines shifted, vibrations deepened, and the docking clamps extended like metallic fingers to claim us. The hum behind my eyes softened slightly as the final approach began. The sensation was not relief, but a recognition. The next phase awaited, and there would be no turning back. The anchors held, taut and fragile, as we slid toward the station, toward the threshold of the Emperor's dominion. Beyond this point, the journey would cease to be about transport and begin to be about confrontation, with the unknown, the inevitable, and with ourselves. I closed my eyes and clutched the red cloth on my wrist, letting the anchors thread through me one last time. The black ship hummed beneath us, a living entity in patient anticipation. The stars blurred past the viewport, indifferent and eternal, as Terra rose beneath, immense, impossible, and waiting. The journey to Terra was complete. But the trial, the reckoning, was only just beginning. The docking clamps closed around the black ship with a slow, deliberate hiss, a sound that reverberated through my bones like the final chord of a requiem. The hum behind my eyes pulsed sharply in response, insistent, as though the vessel itself exhaled after a long, measured breath. Beyond the viewport, the docking station's metallic arms shifted, welcoming us into its cavernous interior, stretching outward like the fingers of a colossal, unfeeling hand. The stars above Terra were no longer distant points. They seemed to lean closer, pressing their cold gaze upon us as if the universe itself were aware of our presence. Inside, the station was immense, a cathedral of steel and ritual fused into a structure too vast to comprehend in a single glance. The floors were polished obsidian, reflecting the faint amber glow of overhead lumens. Mechadendrite swayed in measured arcs, brushing against consoles and runes etched into the walls, issuing soft clicks and whispered incantations. Every motion had purpose, every sound a function both sacred and mechanical. This was no mere harbor. It was a crucible. The black ship had delivered its passengers to the threshold where flesh, mind, and warp would converge. Troopers moved ahead, guiding us down the vast corridor that led to the inner docking chambers. Their armor gleamed faintly, edges worn from centuries of duty, the Aquila insignia etched into breastplates catching light that seemed almost too bright, too deliberate. I noticed the subtle way they moved in tandem, the precise spacing between them, the careful avoidance of any gesture that might trigger latent warp-touched reactions. They were both guardians and shepherds, their presence a buffer between mortal frailty and the incomprehensible forces we were about to face. Sela whispered beside me, voice trembling. "It's bigger than I imagined." I didn't respond. Words were fragile here, too easily swallowed by the enormity of the space, by the resonance that pressed against the edges of thought. The hum behind my eyes had shifted, no longer merely a pulse but a subtle, layered presence, brushing against memory and fear alike. It probed the anchors I clutched, testing their strength, seeking the gaps where uncertainty might slip in. I forced my thoughts inward, threading my mother's hands, the red cloth on my wrist, the coin in my palm, and the quiet syllables of Sela's repeated name into a lattice of survival. Anchors were lifelines, and they were all that stood between comprehension and unraveling. The tech priest moved alongside the troopers, mechadendrites brushing against consoles and terminals, chanting prayers in clicks and hums that resonated with a tone almost alien. Each phrase seemed to stabilize the ambient resonance, threading it back into a manageable rhythm. I realized then that the black ship and its attendants were not simply moving us, they were calibrating us, tuning our minds to the thresholds we were about to cross. Every whisper, every brush of metal against metal, was part of a liturgy I could not yet comprehend. A sudden shift in the station's gravity field caused the corridor to tilt slightly. It was subtle, barely perceptible, yet the hum spiked sharply behind my skull, and I had to anchor myself more tightly. Sela gasped softly, and I felt the grip of fear in him, a mirror of the tension threading through the rest of the Chosen. The trooper crouched beside us again, hand lightly brushing my shoulder in acknowledgement. He said nothing, yet the gesture conveyed understanding. Some thresholds were not crossed by instruction. They required presence, attention, and the fragile tether of human contact to endure. Through the viewport ahead, the docking chamber opened like a yawning cathedral. Light spilled in, almost holy in its intensity, reflecting off walls lined with arcane symbols and etched sigils of the Emperor. Far above, the vast inner dome shimmered faintly, a lattice of energy fields that hummed in time with the warp touch we all carried. The Chosen were herded forward, one group at a time, the harnesses clinking softly against the floor. Every step echoed like judgment, each footfall a note in the silent litany of what was to come. I pressed my palms to the restraints, feeling the cold metal, the vibration through the deck, the faint pulse in my veins. The black ship's hum was no longer external. It had threaded itself into perception, into memory, into the very space between thought and flesh. It whispered promise and threat simultaneously, a duality that made the anchors tremble but hold. And then, beyond the corridor, I glimpsed the first sight that would define the threshold. A massive chamber, vast beyond reckoning, with platforms suspended above a glow too bright to name. Figures moved across the platforms in ritual cadence, tech priests, troopers, and forms I could not yet comprehend. Their presence radiated authority, control, and something older, darker, and more demanding than fear alone. The hum behind my eyes surged, rising to a crescendo that pressed against every nerve, every memory, every fragment of the self I had so carefully anchored. The threshold had been reached. The chamber stretched farther than the eye could track, its ceiling lost in shadows that shimmered with faint, golden lumens. Platforms hovered over a vast pit of light that seemed alive, pulsing with an energy that defied description. Each pulse reverberated through the floor, through the walls, and through the very air, setting the hum behind my eyes into a higher, sharper rhythm. It was not sound, exactly, but perception, a pressure that tugged at thought and memory alike. I felt my anchors quiver under the weight, yet they held, fragile, taut, defiant. The Chosen were ushered forward, moving as a procession of whispers and shadows. Troopers flanked us on either side, armor gleaming under the unnatural light, their expressions masked but precise. They spoke only when necessary, issuing commands that were both directive and measured, their words threading a thin line of order through the madness that threatened to seep from the very walls. The black ship had delivered us here, and now we were to step across the threshold that separated the vessel from the Emperor's inner dominion. Sela's voice trembled beside me. Do they know what we are?" I did not answer. Some questions had no safety in their truth. Being chosen was not a gift. It was a summons. And the hum behind my thoughts, the resonance that had accompanied us since the shuttle, was now insistent, almost alive, as if acknowledging that we were close enough to be recognized. It brushed against the edges of my consciousness with subtle insistence, threading curiosity and judgment together, and I felt the weight of something older than memory pressing in. The trooper crouched beside Sela and me again, speaking quietly. "Names," he murmured. "Say them. Keep the tether alive." I repeated mine silently, threading each syllable through the lattice of anchors. Mother's hands. The coin pressed into my palm. Sela's whispered name. Each repetition reinforced the fragile line that separated perception from unraveling, and for a brief moment, I felt the hum ease just enough to take a breath. The tech priest advanced along the raised platforms, mechadendrites brushing against etched consoles and glowing runes. Each motion was precise, deliberate, almost ceremonial. His incantations, soft clicks and hums, resonated across the chamber in waves that seemed to stabilize the energy surrounding us. I realized that the black ship, the station, the tech priest, the troopers, they were all instruments, working to maintain a fragile harmony as the chosen approached the inner sanctum. Every movement, every sound, was part of a larger liturgy, one we were only beginning to comprehend. Ahead, the first glimpse of the inner sanctum struck me with awe and terror in equal measure. A platform hovered above the glowing pit, far larger than the corridor or docking chamber, and on it moved figures shrouded in golden light and ceremonial regalia. Their faces were obscured, yet their authority radiated in waves that pressed against the chest like physical weight. They gestured with calm precision, guiding energy, calibrating resonance, moving in a choreography older than Terra herself. Every gesture, every step, seemed synchronized with the hum that filled my mind, as though the chamber itself were breathing, alive and aware. The chosen were moved onto the platform in small groups, each step echoing like judgment, each pause timed to match the slow pulse of light beneath. The pit below shimmered, vast and unknowable, its glow reflecting off the metal and glass around us, washing the chamber in color too vivid to name. It radiated awareness, a silent observation that drew the mind outward and inward at once. I felt the hum peak again, sharp and insistent, a presence brushing against my mind. Thoughts threatened to unravel, memories flickered like failing flames, and yet the anchors, delicate and precious, held. My mother's voice, the coin, the names, the memory of Sela repeating his, threads woven tightly into a lattice strong enough to resist the pull. The vessel, the station, the chamber, they did not break us. They tested us. They sought the gaps where fear might crack the mind. And I realized, with a clarity both exhilarating and terrifying, that this was only the beginning. The trooper's hand brushed briefly against my shoulder. "Focus," he said. "Not on what waits below. Not on what is above. Only on what is yours to hold." I nodded, though it felt inadequate. What was mine? My name, my memory, my fleeting sense of self, all of it seemed so fragile against the vastness of the chamber, against the intensity of the glowing pit and the figures that moved with deliberate authority. And yet, there was power in the holding, in threading thought through anchors that survived when the rest of the mind threatened to dissolve. The platform tilted gently, aligning with the inner sanctum's central axis. Ahead, the figures paused, their gestures halting mid-motion. A stillness spread across the chamber, subtle yet profound, and I felt the hum behind my skull reach a crescendo, like the tightening of a coil ready to snap or release. The black ship had carried us this far. The station had guided us. And now, the threshold awaited, silent, patient, and unyielding. I inhaled slowly, holding the breath as long as I dared. The anchors were taut. The chosen were aligned. And the chamber waited. The threshold of divinity had been reached. The stillness of the chamber pressed against my skin, heavier than any harness, heavier than the hum that had threaded itself into my consciousness. Every step forward felt like moving through water, slow and deliberate, yet every inch carried the weight of inevitability. The pit below shimmered with light that was neither warm nor cold, a color that seemed to bend perception itself. It radiated awareness, almost sentient, observing, measuring, waiting. I could feel the hum behind my eyes interacting with it, two presences in dialogue beyond my comprehension, tugging and probing, threading threads of thought across the edges of fear and memory. Sila's small hand sought mine again. His grip was fragile, yet unyielding, and for a moment I allowed myself to anchor to him as I had to the coin, the red cloth, the memory of Mother's hands. Names, objects, recollections, all fragile threads holding me in a reality that seemed eager to unravel. The trooper moved alongside us, silent but vigilant, a tether against the chaos that brushed the edges of thought. His presence reminded me that even in the vast machinery of the Emperor's will, human vigilance remained a lifeline, however thin. Ahead, the figures on the central platform shifted, their movements deliberate and precise. Gold and crimson robes fluttered faintly, though there was no wind. Their gestures guided currents of energy that I could not see fully, but could feel in the resonance, in the pull at the edges of consciousness. Each movement was a calibration, a ritual, a test. The hum behind my skull spiked sharply, almost like recognition. They had sensed us, felt us threading through the lattice of anchors, measuring the strength of what we held. The platform beneath our feet began to vibrate subtly, not violently, but perceptibly, as though acknowledging our approach. The pit below glowed brighter, casting long, shifting shadows across walls lined with sigils and runes. The light was intoxicating, overwhelming, and yet it revealed nothing of what lay within. Only presence. Only awareness. Only the subtle insistence that we were no longer merely passengers but participants in something vast, something divine, something unyielding. A whisper reached my mind, faint, almost lost in the resonance. Chosen, step forward. It was not voice, not word, not even sound, but a suggestion, a beckoning. I gritted my teeth and threaded my anchors tighter, forcing myself to remember what was mine, what was held against the pull. The black ship had carried us across the void. The station had guided our passage. Now, the threshold demanded more: presence, recognition, endurance. The trooper crouched beside Sila and me again. "Keep the anchors tight," he said softly. "Do not let the currents pull you. One thought at a time, one thread at a time." I nodded, repeating silently, "My name, Sila, Mother, coin, red cloth." The lattice of thought held, taut but unbroken. Around me, the other chosen echoed in silence, some whispering fragments of memory, others still and wide-eyed, all bound by the same invisible tension. The tech priest moved among us, his mechadendrites brushing against consoles and runes, chanting liturgies in clicks and hums that resonated with the pit below. Each movement, each whispered syllable, seemed to stabilize the energy, threading a fragile harmony between flesh, mind, and the incomprehensible presence below. The figures on the central platform paused. Light from the pit shimmered upward, casting reflections that danced across the chamber in impossible geometries. Shadows fell and shifted, making the air itself seem alive, charged with anticipation. I felt the hum spike again, not threatening but insistent, almost curious, brushing against memory and thought, probing the strength of the anchors I held. I took a breath, careful, deliberate, letting it thread through my chest, through the red cloth, through my mind. The presence behind my skull softened slightly, acknowledging the strength of what I held. Sela's hand squeezed mine. The trooper's eyes met mine briefly, unspoken communication. Endure, hold, survive. The tech priest murmured a final calibration, and the pit's light dimmed fractionally, stabilizing as though the chamber itself awaited only one action: our crossing. I realized then that the threshold of divinity was not simply a place, nor a challenge, nor a test of power. It was a mirror. The hum, the pit, the figures, the black ship, they reflected the strength of what the chosen held inside. Memory, identity, anchors against unraveling. To step forward was to accept that the world, the warp, the Emperor, and ourselves would see everything. Every fear, every hope, every fragment of self laid bare. The first group of chosen moved forward across the platform, one step at a time, their movements echoing through the chamber like measured chords. I tightened my grasp on Sela's hand and inhaled slowly. My anchors were taut, fragile, and yet unbroken. The threshold awaited. The reckoning was imminent. And in that moment, I understood. Crossing it was not survival alone. It was the admission that nothing would ever be the same. I exhaled. The hum softened, threading into a calm rhythm, but not entirely. The presence remained, patient, aware, eternal. The threshold had been crossed by the first. Now it was our turn.